Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're listening to us from. Today, as we all know, is the third day of this conference. And today, at this session, we'll be discussing on building trauma-sensitive school. And with me is Jen Alexander. So before we start let me give you a brief introduction of who she is and what she has accomplished in the years. Jen Alexander is an experienced trauma-informed educator, school counselor, expert on childhood trauma, global speaker, and consultant. She is also the author of Building Trauma-Sensitive Schools and Supporting Students and Staff after COVID and staffs after COVID-19, known by children and adults alike as Miss Jane. She loves helping kids and giving others the tools and strategies they need to help kids survive. So, my name is Hopewell, and I am part of the ICTE team. So today, we shall listen to how we can build trauma-sensitive schools and become better of ourselves. All right, Jane Alexander, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Hopewell, for that introduction and everyone for being here, whether you are engaging live with us today or catching the recording. I am very honored to be presenting at this conference and working with you here today. I am not able to see the slides. There we go. They're up. You read my mind. As Hopewell mentioned, I'm the author of Building Trauma Sensitive Schools, and that is a book that I wrote several years ago and have had an opportunity to work with thousands of educators, not just in the US where I'm from, but in other countries as well, to talk about what is a trauma sensitive school, but what are the actions that it takes for us to create these safer, more supportive learning environments that are actually good for all of us. I'll tell you more about that in a bit, but I would love to hear from some folks in the chat if you care to share. Um, Feel free to introduce yourself if you'd like. Share with us where you're from. If you want to engage with the poll, you can tell us what your role is in terms of its adjacency to education. And when you're ready, I'd love to know your perceptions about if you were to think of education as a game, whatever game may be culturally relevant to you or to your own youth. Some of the games that are relevant to my lived experience are up on the screen right now, but you may have different games that you played as a child or that you play with your family now, or that you play with your friends as an adult as well. And if you were to compare education and your role in education, what you are observing in education, if you will, to a game that you know, what game would it be and why? I'd love to see some thoughts in the chat as we get started. Thank you to those of you who are introducing yourselves, joining in with us. We have a leader from South India. Ellen is on from Taiwan. Ravathi, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, please let me know. One of the games I'll go ahead and share that I think of in relation to education, whether it's my own experience as a student, a grad student, a teacher, a school counselor, now a leader who partners with schools and districts to help them learn about trauma, its effects, and what we can do about it at school. The game that comes to mind for me is tic-tac-toe. Whether you're familiar with it or not, it's a pretty simple game. You play with a partner. One person puts down an X, one person puts down an O. You have these 9 boxes that are available to you, and you try to get 3 O's if O is your symbol, or you try to get 3 X's if X is your symbol in a row. And so it's a game of strategy. You're making choices, but you're also strategizing, not just based on your own ideas of how you want to try to win the game, but also in response to the person you're playing with. And there's so much of what we do in education that's like that. We make choices, we have hopes, dreams, even informed hypotheses about what we're going to do, why we're going to head in that direction, but yet we need to be responsive to the people we're engaging with as we notice the need and meet the need, as I like to call it, within our roles, whatever our role may be in education. In the States, we think of X's and O's as symbols that can go with care and love as well. And because of that, I also think tic-tac-toe is appropriate because anything we do within education isn't just about academics or the upstairs brain and cognitive development. We're also educating people in their hearts. And social emotional learning is incredibly important as we think about how we're going to be in global community with one another and in a way that stops and also prevents injustice so that we can all live more safely and be more supportive of one another in connection within community. I see somebody else who's mentioned that maybe it's like Candyland because there's an exploration where great things happen, but also challenges that might set us back. So if you're not familiar with that game, it's a board game and you move along the spaces, but then there are things that happen and it might send you back and you're trying to get to the end. Thank you, Ellen, for that. Feel free to keep adding your own suggestions if you're still doing that. As Hopewell said, I am an experienced educator and now a leader and counselor who works with other educators to help them understand how to build trauma sensitive learning environments. I wrote Building Trauma Sensitive Schools. I also just recently wrote and created an online course called Becoming a Trauma Sensitive Educator. It is my belief, my passion that every educator must be a trauma sensitive one. And I can teach you more about what that means and how we can get there for each and every one of us. It's more of a journey than a destination. I'm not sure we'll ever reach it because it's something we are striving towards. And it requires that we understand and grow in our awareness of self just as much as we're understanding the research in relation to the neurobiology of harm and what it does to us in terms of health, behavior, relationships, and learning. At the same time, we have to be open to learning from one another's lived experiences because trauma affects folks in very different ways and it can affect any of us at any time, although some groups are obviously made more vulnerable to harm than others. I'm on all the social media applications that I can possibly think of, so if you want to join me there, you are welcome to do so. Carla Shalaby is an author who wrote the book Troublemakers, and it's a beautiful read. And she said these words: I think of the children who make trouble at school as minors' canaries. I want us to imagine their behaviors, which are admittedly disruptive, hypervisible, and problematic, as both the loud sound of their suffering and a signal cry to the rest of us that there is poison in our shared air. Trauma affects individuals, people in relationships, and entire communities and systems. And we have to understand that the effects of harm can be judged negatively as something inherent to a person or a problem that they have or are exhibiting, when really it's the conditions that we're all experiencing in different ways to different degrees that are affecting each and every one of us and can harm us all. So my goal isn't merely to help you understand trauma responses so you and your people can adjust better to trauma's effects in your schools. That's important, but it's not the only thing. I want to partner with you in facilitating change in your own practices and within systems so we can stop harm and create genuine safety that improves teaching and learning for everyone. Safer, more supportive learning environments are best for each and every one of us. I agree. There's a comment in the chat that says trauma is as old as man. Absolutely. We are capable as humans of love, connection, collaboration, creativity, and dreaming and creating things that are amazing for humans and for the planet. And at the same time, we are capable of such incredible harm. That's why as we talk about this topic today and learn together, it's important that we take good care of ourselves and one another. We all come into this learning space with our own histories, our own experiences, whether they're long ago or very recent. And when we talk about a topic like stress or trauma, it can tap into our own stuff and stir up those memories, those feelings that we have in our bodies. And it's important that you take good care of yourself. I will never do anything to intentionally overwhelm you or ask you to go into your own trauma. And I ask that you don't do that with any learner you're working with either. Rather, it's important to give lots of choices and to use invitations. So, what I'll say to you is that everything that I invite you to do today is just that, it's an invitation. You can choose to accept that invitation, change it, decline it, participate through observation if that's what's best for you. I trust you to make decisions that are best for you. That said, you can take a break if you need to, grab something to drink, engage in the chat, or don't. You know what's best for you. We'll start with just a moment of quiet to help ourselves get ready for our learning today. If you want to take some belly breaths, if that's helpful to you, you're welcome to do that. It's not helpful to everyone, by the way. Maybe there's something else that is helpful to you to help you ground and center and be ready to learn. Perhaps it's looking around the space that you're in, wherever that might be, finding a color, a texture that's comforting to you, knowing that if something gets stirred up or shut down inside of yourself, you can take your eyes to that color, texture, or thing to help regulate and come back to your learning. If those aren't fits for you and you can't think of something that would be, you're also welcome to scroll on a device for just a moment while we take a moment of quiet. Thank you. I hope that was of help to you. I see a comment in the chat about the art. I love the art as well. And if, as you notice on this slide, I've cited Iveta. This is much of the art here is hers. I've purchased from her. She does incredible work. Today, we're going to explore questions that you have about trauma and what it means to build a trauma-sensitive learning environment. We're actually going to start with that pretty early in the session. I'm going to teach you one word that you can change in your vocabulary in your own language as a first step toward establishing safer, more supportive schools. And I hope you will be able to identify at least one right now trauma-sensitive action that you will start taking more often and be thinking about future ones that you could implement too. I have several handouts prepared for you. You can access them from this QR code. Everything there is for your use as an individual with your classroom or your team that you're working with. And there are several things there that might be of benefit to you to extend your learning from today. Let's start with the definition of trauma. In my books, Building Trauma-Sensitive Schools and also Becoming a Trauma-Sensitive Educator, I define trauma in a detailed way. Here, I want to use a more user-friendly, simplified version that is one I use with all staff members and even students when appropriate to do so. Trauma is experiencing too much stress, often for too long, and perhaps with not enough support, causing harmful effects. Everybody experiences stress, challenges, difficulties that come up, and not all stress is bad. It's when stress becomes too much and is overwhelming for the individual's nervous system that it changes the way the nervous system functions, not only immediately in and after that event, but it can make changes that continue afterwards too. And this may lead folks to re-experience that harm again and again because their body is so activated by what they went through, or it can cause people to shut down and their nervous system to go into a state of withdrawal, feeling numb, having low energy, which goes with disengagement in relationships. And often folks who have experienced big stress go back and forth between re-experiencing in their body or even in their mind things like flashbacks or a reliving of what they went through, nightmares too. And they go back and forth between that activation, think your body pushing on the gas pedal with big energy inside, and the anxiety and anger or irritability that can go with it, and then switching to like their body pushing on the braking system and feeling shut down and pulled away from folks. And these changes in the body that happen in response to big stress can happen based on one event, a series of events, or living in um, traumatic experiences repeatedly in one's life. So we can think of it as activation and shutdown, and it has all kinds of effects on our functioning in many different ways. In fact, there's no part of the body and how it functions that's not affected by trauma when it is occurring. Now, what's too much for one person may not be too much for someone else. And so we can't say, oh, this event is always traumatic. It's based on how that individual is interacting with it, their own biology and neurobiology, their temperament, the supports that they have, what stressors they've experienced up to that point or not, their health in general, and so much more. So while there are some events that are so overwhelming, think genocide, war, the horrors that can happen, those can be traumatizing and often are for anyone who experiences them. There are other things that may be traumatic for someone and not traumatic for someone else. Our neurodivergence affects this too, because we all have different windows of tolerance, if you will, different examples of things that might feel too much or not enough for us based on how our biological system is uniquely ours. Thank you. There are some examples coming into the chat already of things that can be traumatic. Let's continue with that. If you want to, feel free to share some examples of potential traumas that could be affecting folks in your community. No stories or details that are about it, but if you could just name what some of those potential traumas could be, I think that would be helpful to us. And Hopewell, thanks for putting the link to the drive where the handouts are in the chat as well. As you're doing that, I'm checking the poll to see that most of us are educators and leaders in this session who are here live. Those watching may be in those other categories of researcher, policymaker, or student. And if I missed anyone in those categories, I apologize as well. Feel free to correct me in the chat. Thank you, Ravati, for bringing up collective trauma. Yes, trauma that affects an entire group of people and can be rooted in marginalization, discrimination, and atrocities that occur too. Yes, there are medical traumas that are being listed. Abuse is coming up. Definitely. Here is my list of potential possible traumatic events. Again, we can't say it's always traumatic for each person. It's based on their individual experience and the effects that they experience afterwards. This is not to say that this is an exhaustive list. There are other things that can potentially be traumatic that are not here. Depending on the groups that I'm working with, racism, discrimination, genocide, war, oppression may or may not come up as potential traumas. I'm from the States, the United States, and sometimes when I work with educators, particularly white educators like myself, who have their own lived experience and adjacency to privilege and power, may not have as depth of an understanding that many people personally do as to how social contexts drive trauma for groups, and that some groups are marginalized and made more vulnerable to personal traumas. And it's so important that we all recognize that so that we can work together to stop those harms, prevent them, and prepare ourselves to be in relationship globally in ways that make the world a better place for each and every one of us. Trauma also happens on school campuses. So let's think about that in the chat for a moment. What are some traumas that might happen at school for folks? Bullying came up right away. Absolutely. any type of discrimination, harm, whether that's to the LGBTQIA plus community, whether it's based on people's faiths or their ethnicities and race, their culture. And it can be linked to other differences between folks, disabilities, for instance, and it's not always linked to a difference either. Yeah. When educators don't understand the learners that they're working with, misunderstand their needs, that definitely can lead to intolerance, and it can lead to big stress for youth, especially if it's ongoing and they experience that over time. Ellen, you're right. Educators are also experiencing trauma, overwhelming demands, and some are serving as witness to others' harm and carrying those stories inside themselves too. Thank you for mentioning microaggressions as well. I used to tell kids as a teacher and a counselor that school is a safe place. And I then stopped doing that because schools aren't safe. And whatever your educational environment is, whether it's a school or not, they're not necessarily safe for each and every person. So when I talk with educators about trauma sensitivity, it's really about what are we doing actively to make them safer and more supportive, because there are things we can do to make them safer. Even though we haven't reached safe yet, it's still the goal that we're aiming towards. I, along with other leaders in the trauma-informed kind of niche, think of trauma like an iceberg. So what we might observe in people, their actions, the outward display of their emotions, but also their thinking and how they engage with self and others in relationship in various settings, are affected by big stress, primarily those energy changes that happen in relationship and also happen in self, but also happen in relationship. And those are really influencing what we see on the outside, the tip of the iceberg, and underneath are those personal traumas. But if we stop there in the iceberg, what the research tells us is that educators and other folks too will tend to blame families and communities for the harm. So teachers may say something like, well, that kid isn't doing so well in school, maybe that's because the parents are disengaged and they don't care. you know one parent is incarcerated, that could be part of the problem. And so the blame goes to just under the surface, to that personal level of trauma, ignoring the social contexts and harms that often drive those traumas. Now, trauma can happen in any demographic group, yet some groups are more marginalized and made more vulnerable to trauma than others. And there's a point coming up in the chat too, that um, people people's learning needs not being understood at school and their needs not being met can cause big stress and lead to trauma too, and that's absolutely the case. There's also a comment in the trauma or in the chat about how understanding the root factors can help us address them properly. And I think that's absolutely true when we're talking about stopping the harm. Like the more we can understand neglect, sexual abuse, and also racism, genocide, oppression, injustice, the more we can understand those harms, the more we will be able to take action to stop them. At the same time, when it comes to individuals at school, we do not need to know their individual harms and stories to be able to be of support to them. Now, sometimes educators want that information because it helps them be more compassionate and understanding and empathic, but no one's trauma story is actually any of our business unless they feel safe enough and choose to share it with us when they're ready to do so. Asking folks to divulge that information and to go there is not okay. It must be their decision when they're ready for that. And the good news is that we don't have to know what's happened to them to be able to help them within our educational communities. There's a few more people joining in, so glad that you are here. There's different types of trauma that's already started to come up in the chat a bit. A single event trauma, maybe a disaster occurs, It affects an individual, but it also affects communities. Developmental trauma is trauma that happens in a child's earliest years of life. Think birth to 3. And it's an ongoing type of trauma that affects how their brain and nervous system develop. It can be influenced by social harms that are occurring, and it can be related to traumas that happen in their closest relationships too. Think child abuse, for instance. What happens is that that child is needing adults to keep them safe, and for whatever reason, whether it's what's happening outside of that family or what's happening inside of those relationships, they're not able to keep that child safe. And so there's these big stress reactions happening without the support that can stop the harm, and perhaps without the support to help folks recover from it too, because it just keeps happening. And that changes the way that child's nervous system and brain develop, which can affect functioning throughout their entire lifetime, particularly if there's not early intervention. Collective trauma is trauma and big stress that overwhelms people based on what happens in a group. Historical trauma is trauma that affects an entire generation of folks, and it's often linked to power differences and abuses of power between groups. So think enslavement, think the Holocaust. That affects not just the generations who experience it, but the generations to come. Intergenerational trauma is trauma in one generation that gets passed down to another. And sometimes it loses its social context as that occurs. And a lot of judgment happens between groups in relation to that trauma later. And what we really need is to understand how those injustices drove those actions within groups and families, other relationships too, and how that then gets passed down to future generations. Secondary trauma is trauma that occurs when we understand or witness someone else's harm. Judith Herman talked about bearing witness to one another's suffering and how important that is, and yet how that can be too much for the person who's bearing witness, whether that's you're observing someone else be harmed or get murdered, for instance, or you're listening to their story, and then you start to have stress response reactions to that as well. Historical trauma is deep. Absolutely, it is. And there are truths that when we don't understand them and listen to the various perspectives, not only paying attention to those who are in power and the narrative they may create, creates misunderstandings that keep those harms intact. As someone in the United States, I feel that very deeply based on our collective past and the harms that have already been ongoing as a result of our nation, but also within the nation. And I feel that very strongly right now as we just had an election that has really split our country in terms of folks who accept Donald Trump and welcome him as the next president, and those of us who are very afraid of what's to come based on what he promises to do and how that could be harmful to folks in our country and across the globe as well. As I already mentioned, trauma, especially in childhood, can affect folks' development throughout their lifespans, but trauma at any age has impacts too. Impacts to our physiology, how our nervous system and brain function, impacts to our emotions, what we feel in our hearts, and in our minds mentally, but also physically what we feel in our bodies. This affects actions, whether that's aggression or with shutdown and withdrawal or anxiety that makes people kind of cling or pull away. But it affects thinking and cognition as well, making it difficult to tap into those upstairs brain executive functions because our downstairs brain is being turned on so often in response to the big stress, which is what leads to fight, flight, freeze, and appease patterns and behavior that can then be repeated in relationships too. Obviously, big stress affects sense of self, relationships, and can show up differently in different settings. What I want to do now is talk about kind of where we are in education in relation to these truths about trauma. So for those of you who have access to the chat, let's just take this sentence stem, the truth about education right now. What would you say to finish that sentence? The truth about education right now. There's also a question in the Q&A about, is trauma contagious? And so I think what you're asking is, can harm lead to more harm and more harm and more harm? Absolutely. In fact, our nervous system states there is contagion that can go with that. So if you've ever been in a classroom as an educator and one child was crying or one teenager was really kind of grumpy and irritable, and how that can affect folks around them, and that emotional state, that nervous system state, is definitely contagious. And that's especially true. It happens more quickly in emotional states that we might perceive as unhelpful or negative, even feelings that we don't necessarily want to feel. What can also happen is that when folks experience harm and they're overwhelmed in their nervous systems and they have difficulty managing those energy states because it's so big or so shut down, that affects their behavior, which is not necessarily a choice they're making, but it's driven by the nervous system states that they're experiencing. And then that can create more harm and more harm and more harm too. Mm. So there's some comments already about the truth about education. It's outdated, doesn't respect the dignity of the learner. It's not really ready to handle trauma in all its complexities and the immensity of it. Thank you for sharing those. Keep those coming. One of the things I want to add about the truth about education right now is that we are experiencing a global mental health crisis with over 970 million people worldwide having a mental health condition, and most of them are not receiving effective care. The highest kind of rate of those conditions is in relation to anxiety and depression, and those have increased since COVID-19. They were going up prior to COVID-19 too. We also know that depression is starting in girls earlier, and while boys are not being diagnosed with depression at the same rate as girls, it's going up for them too, and they may have more learning disabilities, difficulties at school, whether that's with learning or behavior, and neurodivergence that is affecting their functioning too. Anxiety and suicidality are up, and that includes for those who identify as LGBTQ. Yes, thank you for the comment in the chat. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I would like to pronounce it correctly. So if you want to share that, please do. Um, but you're talking about how really the synergy of trauma, even though you didn't use that word in your comment, but how traumas interact together, which then affects folks individually in more substantial ways sometimes, but it also affects communities and schools and makes what education needs to be really prepared to meet the need in regards to even more layered and complex. Yes. There are differences in how mental health is viewed, access and stigma that are connected to that, but also the resources that are available to support folks are very different for different groups. Great question coming in about what do we do about it? That is absolutely where we are headed next. Where do we go from here? In the United States, the American Psychological Association did a comprehensive assessment of educators based on educators' feelings and the stresses that they're experiencing at school and their observations and impressions of youth stress and what needs to be done about it, particularly as it relates to big behaviors. And the American Psychological Association came out with recommendations that say trauma sensitive practices in social emotional learning curriculum are essential to improving student safety and well being, but also staff safety and well being. And to get there, to get to that implementation, we need training for all educators, regardless of their role, to help us implement these trauma sensitive practices. As we do that, educator voice matters because when we're overwhelmed by stress, it takes control from us. And so anything we do from a trauma informed or trauma sensitive, and for our purposes, I'm going to use those words interchangeably. Anything we do from a trauma sensitive or trauma informed perspective must empower folks, not take their power away, because trauma already disempowers people. And of course, we need to increase resources and supports for curriculum and programming so that folks can implement these approaches that will be better for all of us. And I would add that we must also center student voices just as much as we're centering educator ones, because as Judith Herman and others have eloquently stated, listening is a radical act. There are some comments coming up about how there may be more mental health access in some schools. That's absolutely correct, but it's not enough. It's just a start. Yes. And one of the things I would add to that is that while mental health counseling therapy, whether it's in individuals or groups, has its place and can be very helpful for some folks who've experienced harm, the real power that we have to heal, recover, and fight for change is in community and in relationships. And what occurs in the day to day moments of how we interact with one another is actually the most important thing we can do to help people who are experiencing or have experienced too much stress. It's putting relationships first in the culture of our community, understanding trauma and its effects, and having that influence everything we do from a policy and practice standpoint, but also from a personal one in how we interact with one another in moment to moment ways that allow for relationships that are good and healing for each and every one of us. Because if we operate from the understanding that millions of people are experiencing harm, we're not going to be able to pick them out and farm them out to resources that they need. We don't have those resources available, and they're not necessarily accessible or culturally appropriate for them and a fit for them in their identities either. They actually can do harm many times if they're not a good fit for folks. So we have to really change our mindset about what can we do in community? What are even the small changes we can make that create healing centered environments at school within the communities we're already a part of, while honoring the communities outside of schools that folks are in too, because in community is where healing happens. It happens in relationship. And everybody in a school has an opportunity to interact in relationship with other people all day, every day. Healing can and does happen at school, and it will become even more effective and efficient when everybody understands not only the mechanisms of harm, but the mechanisms of recovery, which is what trauma sensitive education is all about. So, with that in mind, here's my definition of what a trauma sensitive learning environment is. It's a safe and supportive community that enables both children and adults to feel safe, build caring relationships with one another, regulate their feelings and behavior, as well as learn. So, with that in mind, what I would love for you to do is to think of some questions that this definition may bring up for you and put them in the chat. These aren't necessarily questions that we're all going to get answered today, but these questions can be what drives our future learning. And it can also drive our practices from a prevention standpoint. So, what are we going to do to set all kids up for success and to stop harm at school? What are we going to do to be responsive to people who we know have these energy changes happening in their bodies that affects what we call regulation, how they turn that energy and tension up and down in their bodies? How do we develop social emotional curriculum that is trauma sensitive and that goes deep enough to help folks understand their own nervous systems so that we are not only preventing and stopping harm, but helping folks recover from it and have awareness of what's happening to them, because that helps them feel empowered. Plus, it gives them the awareness of what to do about it to help themselves, but also to be supportive of one another, so that our communities are developing in a way intentionally to create safe havens for all of us where we can learn together, teach together, and work together to make the world a more just place for everyone. Okay, the questions are coming in. How does trauma manifest itself physically and psychologically? How do we help as educators? What do we do about it? Yes. What are practical things we can do about it? I'm going to share a few ideas with you today before we leave, I promise. What other questions are coming up? It's a question about what are the misconceptions of trauma? What supports are needed to help schools assess safety concerns and implement effective prevention programs? Excellent questions. Keep those coming. I break down the work of trauma sensitive education and building trauma sensitive schools into 4 essentials, starting at the bottom. And these are in order based on neuroscience. We have to work together to make people and help them have repeated experiences where they can feel safer. Not just be safer, that's the first thing, but also feel safer. Because once people have been harmed, it may be harder for them to feel safe in their own body and in relationship with one another. So, what are we doing to stop harms? What are we doing to identify the harms? What are we doing to set goals and actually stop those harms, including microaggressions, address bullying to make our learning environments safer for each and every person, recognizing that the groups with the most power may not understand the harms that others who are more vulnerable and have been made that way are experiencing. So we have to talk about those things. We have to learn about them as adults, and we have to help youth learn about them in developmentally appropriate ways too. From there, what are we doing to help folks be connected in healthy, culturally sustaining ways, knowing that may be different for different folks related to their neurodivergence, but also their identities and culture? This isn't just everybody liking each other and tolerating one another, but what does it really mean for different people to have a healthy relationship? What does that look like? What are the boundaries that people need to establish within their relationships and in our learning community? And what do we do when those aren't honored? How do we stop that harm? How do we repair it? And where do we go when our own efforts in relationship aren't enough and we need more support? That's true for youth and it's true for adults too. When we think of safety and connection, we can think of it in relation to curriculum and community building that we're doing in our SEL practices. But we can also think of it in relation to content areas. And what has safety looked like historically? What does it look like now? How do historical events and harms influence where we are now? And what can we do about it together in community? How do we solve these problems together? How do we dream a different way of being in community globally together? But it's also about what we do in the moment to moment. So if I'm an educator and I have a student in a classroom who's overwhelmed and having big energy in their body and it's coming out in behavior or they're shut down, what do I do in the moment to help them feel safer? Think leaning into supportive rather than punitive practices, maybe slowing things down because stress responses make us want to speed way up. And how do I communicate that I'm here with this kid and I'm here to support you, not to not to make things harder for you than they already are? And how do we use those invitations in relationships so folks feel empowered? Then we think about getting regulated, which is very much related to our relationships. So what can we do in relationship with learners and with one another to promote healthy regulation? Think how we deal with these stress responses that any of us can be vulnerable to at any time. And some folks, because of their experiences that again, we don't need to know the details about, to be able to be supportive of them. But because of their histories and their lived experiences that could still be occurring now, they're having these responses related to stress in their bodies that are hard for them to manage and control. And it's as scary for them as it may be for people who are seeing their behavior. And then other people aren't showing anything on the outside, but they're feeling it all in the inside. So how do we help people understand those responses in self and in others, but also know how to support one another and what to do about it in a way that can help our nervous systems recover. And so much of that can happen in the day to day of community. And when people feel safer, they're connected in healthy, culturally sustaining ways. They are getting regulated in relationship because it's not something we have to do on our own. We're all going to have more energy and efficiency that will go into our teaching and learning. And that will enable us to help kids have access to ambitious learning and learn about what we can do to make a more just world. And so all of this is proactive and responsive in and out throughout everything we do during the day. I'm going to scooch past that. One of the things that I kind of root this work in are the phrases, how do we notice the need and meet the need? Again, we don't have to know everybody's trauma stories or histories to be able to be supportive of them. We can just accept that trauma is all around us. Its effects are in our classrooms and in our personal and community relationships. And we can approach every person as if they've been harmed because that approach is actually good for each and every one of us. Anything we do to make each other feel safer, to connect in healthy ways, to say good morning and to greet folks, and to engage in a way with presence makes a difference. And when we focus on regulation with all kids and all adults, that's going to help us make safer, healthier, better regulated communities where we can stand up for one another and stop harm. Notice the need, meet the need. Now, that doesn't mean it's all on you to notice everybody's needs and meet them, but how do we do that collectively from within our roles and boundaries as educators? So let's dive deeper into that. As we think about this next part and the what do we do about harm and what are some practical actions you can take based on this session, you might be thinking as an educator, but you might also be thinking as an educational or community leader. You make those decisions and you might go back and forth between them as well. I also want you to know that the things I'm going to share with you in these last minutes, the practical things you might try, all come from my new free leadership guide that you can access here from this QR code. And it's in the drive. The QR code is there too. This is free on my publisher's website. It's something I wrote and we wanted to be easily accessible to everyone. And you're welcome to share this far and wide with folks so they can learn trauma sensitive practices for their leadership roles too. There are 6 principles in the guide, and we're going to go over those, and I'll give you something practical to take away in relation to each one of them. As we learn trauma sensitive practices, we must be willing to challenge and change current practices. We have to be open to that, or the work's not going to work. We also have to believe that relationship is the evidence-based practice because it is. That's not to say that caring about someone in and of itself is enough. There are things and skills that every educator needs to develop to be able to engage in relationships in a way that help people feel safer, better connected, more regulated, and ready to learn. But relationship is where the recovery and healing happens. That's because the power of connection is incredible. We're biologically built for connection. And as mammals, we need connection with others to keep one another safe. And that's why our bodies are designed to signal safety or not to one another. And much of that comes from our face. So, one of the things that we can do as trauma sensitive educators is pay attention to how we carry our own stress because we have a lot of stress, whether that's personal or linked to the responsibility in our roles. And we can, when we encounter folks, make a practice of intentionally softening our face, our eyes, because that in itself signals safety to folks. And the more we can become aware of how we carry our stress, what our kind of facial expressions, our tone of voice, our speed of interacting with others, how we kind of generally come across, and then make small adjustments to that can make an incredible difference. I worked with a student one time from early years of education all the way up through, I believe it was 6th grade. And as he was getting ready to transition to a different building, he had made so much growth in his behavior and in his academics. This is a kid who'd been through a whole lot. And I knew that as a counselor, but not anybody else on the team knew the details of that. And I said to him, You made so much growth. We are so proud of you. Can you name some things that you think made the biggest difference for you? It's good for us to know what those are so that we can do them for other kids. And he said, I know what it is. It's your voice. It's your voice. He said, I would get so upset and so stirred up inside, and I would have these behaviors. But when you came, you were always caring. You didn't yell at me. You weren't mad at me. You had this voice that made me feel safer. And it got to where it wasn't just that you came, it's if I knew you were coming, I would start to know she's coming and I'm going to hear that voice and it's going to help me feel better. And later it was, I could imagine it in my mind and that helped me to feel better. This is the power of relationship. This is the power of changes we can make in how we interact with one another that make a difference in the moment. Because once we understand that what's driving some of these disruptive behaviors at school is a nervous system reaction, the last thing we want to do if it's coming from stress is to make people more stressed. So threats, punishments, shame, withdrawal of relationship, all of that increases the stress response. And once we understand that our goal is to decrease stress responses, then we're going to go in softer. We're still going to set boundaries. We're still going to have limits, but we're going to interact in a way that brings presence and safety in the moment while we're setting limits. So the word and is going to be our friend. We're going to set limits and have high expectations and be empathic and compassionate while we're doing it. So we can say things to kids like, I cannot let that action continue. It's not safe. I'm here to help you with it. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to invite you to do. Let's work on this together. So at the same time, we need relationships. We also have to understand that what's the number one predator for humans? Other humans. We need each other, and yet we're each other's number one threat. That leads to this push and pull dynamic in relationships. I need you. That scares me. I want to push you away. That can happen for all of us, and it's even more pronounced for folks who have experienced trauma. So we also have to teach educators, and this is much more in depth, how do we engage in a way in these push and pull dynamics that we're not recreating cycles of harm with kids in our relationships with them? How do we interrupt that and give them a different experience in relationship with us? And the great news is there is so much we can do. And it's things I can teach you and I can teach your educators too. One of the first things is to recognize that when we're concerned about behavior, behavior isn't actually the problem. It's linked to a nervous system response. Doesn't mean trauma is always the cause of that, but there's some kind of nervous system response, whether it's caused by stress or not. And the great news is that when it is trauma, trauma-sensitive practices work. And when it's not trauma, it's something else causing the dysregulation, trauma-sensitive practices still work. They're actually good for all of us. So the first priority is to help people feel safer with us. And then we have to understand that that doesn't necessarily mean people feel comfortable. So being comfortable is not the same thing as being safe. In fact, we have to help people get a little uncomfortable sometimes to understand their part in harms that might be happening and changes that need to be made. That includes educators and ourselves. But safety is the goal. And to get there, we can still maintain high expectations. High expectations for learning and behavior go together. So trauma doesn't become an excuse for behaviors that potentially are disruptive or harmful to others at school. But how can we approach those struggles in a way that doesn't perpetuate harmful patterns? And here's my number one suggestion to you. Change the word disrespectful or any other word similar to it that may be used in your communities. Change the word disrespectful to dysregulated or distressed. When we say, oh, that kid's being disrespectful, it puts us in a place of power over them. And we tend to feel entitled to push them to be more compliant and to do what we expect them to do. A lot of shoulds come out, punishments come out, shame comes out. But if we say, that kid is engaging in those actions because for some reason, we don't have to know the reason, they're dysregulated inside. That is a shift that takes us to a different place. It becomes, how do I help them feel safer? How do I remind them I'm on their side? I'm going to set limits, but I want to help them with the dysregulation they're experiencing. And once they're better regulated, then we can have a conversation about maybe what happened and the repair and the restoration that needs to occur, or helping them understand how their actions affected others. Or we can get back to our learning in the classroom and the curriculum and how important that is to continue to ensure kids have access to that ambitious learning. But understanding that it's dysregulation, not disrespect, is a huge piece of how we get there. And I want to give you one example of what that can look like in the classroom. So Penny is a student who is not getting her English project done at all. The deadline's coming up, and the teacher in the past would have started telling her, you got to get it done. Maybe you can come and get some help. But even if offering that, she doesn't take them up on that, the teacher might start to remind her of the consequences that are going to happen if she doesn't get that work done. All things that can increase the stress response, but tend to be how educators have experienced education, or what they were even taught to do as educators from a behavior modification standpoint. But with trauma sensitive training, this educator understood something's going on here. There's a reason, even if we don't know what it is, that's causing this learner to not get this work done. And so the educator has a conversation with Penny and says, I don't know what's up, but for some reason the work's not getting done. Is there anything you want to share with me? And Penny said, well, I'm writing this paper on how social media can harm kids. And I'm trying to write about the experience I've had because it was so horrible what I went through. And I'm getting frozen as I start to write it because it's hard for me to write. And the teacher's able to say, oh my goodness, of course you're getting stuck. Of course it's not getting done. I don't need to know the horrors of what you went through, but I believe you that that was a lot. And let me help you think of a different example to write about, because that's your story. You don't have to share it with everyone. And there are ways to approach this that won't overwhelm you, and you can still make a difference with what you're writing about. That's what trauma sensitivity in action really looks like. We understand that dysregulation in youth or adults isn't disobedience, it's a stress response that we can't punish, shame, or reward anyone out of. I really appreciate that you have been here in this session today. I want to share just a couple of ways that you can get more information as we finish up here. So let me get to this ending. And there are some things in the drive, as I said, that you can access as well. As you can see, I always plan more than what we can get to, because I always want to give you lots and lots of things that are practical and that you can use right away. There is more information on my website. I put out things on social media. You're welcome to follow me and all of those places for free information. That guide QR code is in the drive. Please access that and take good care of yourself and your people. If you'd like to share in the chat something that you're going to take away from today, I would love to hear what that is as we sign off. And know too that there is a sheet that looks like this in the drive that can help you think about, in a more detailed way, what your next trauma sensitive actions may be as an individual, but also as a team member. So that's something that you might want to take a look at after our work together today. But if you want to leave a takeaway in the chat, I would love to hear what it is. Something maybe that you're leaving this session with today. Not needing to know the story. Yes. Hopewell, is the drive link working?
Yes, it
Very good.
is. I posted that earlier, but I'll see. Okay.
And I have a QR code here at the end as well. I'll leave you with Sarah Wilson's words. Keep going, for action begets action, and from little things, big things grow. You can't do it all at once, but each step matters. And when we're all working together, it matters even more. And in this work, I'm here for you. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there are ideas that you have, and I have ideas too, about how we can work together and I can support your work with your entire educational communities. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the difference that you make on behalf of and with learners every single day. Here's the
Right.
QR
Thank you.
as well.
Thank you, Jane. I really learned so much from this session. Trauma is real and it can be managed. Actually, it's okay. So we thank you for giving us this insightful and impactful session. So to the audience, thank you for your engagement and the contributions to making sure that this session was engaging. So we say thank you. All right.